Know your place!
I do. I'm the woman who owns this company, and you're fired.
My husband's secretary kissed him in front of 500 employees. When I told her to step away, he shoved me to the floor and shouted, "Know your place?" Everyone laughed, until I stood up, took the microphone, and revealed who really owned the company. Hello, my name is Lyra Dinat, and 3 years ago, I learned that humiliation can either destroy you or show you exactly where your power has been hiding. The night my husband became CEO was supposed to be the proudest night of our marriage. Instead, it became the night our marriage ended, and the night his carefully constructed life began to collapse. The ceremony was held in the grand ballroom of the Halston Hotel in Chicago. Crystal lights hung from the ceiling. A giant silver screen displayed my husband's name in gold letters, Even Binet. An NDW, OFLIDR site. 500 employees filled the room. Board members sat at the front. Reporters stood near the stage. Everything looked perfect. Evan looked perfect too. He wore the dark suit I had bought for him after his first major promotion. He stood under the lights with one hand raised, promising integrity, loyalty, and respect. I almost laughed at the word respect. For months, Evan had treated me like an inconvenience. He stopped asking about my day. He hid his phone. He came home after midnight smelling of expensive perfume that I did not own. Whenever I asked a question, he said I was insecure. Still, I had come to support him. I wanted to believe 20 years of marriage meant more than my suspicions. Then his secretary, Vanessa Cole, walked onto the stage. Vanessa was 32, beautiful, and always perfectly dressed. She carried herself as if every room belonged to her. She handed Evan a glass award, placed one hand on his chest, and kissed him on the mouth. It was not an accidental kiss. It was slow, confident, and familiar. The room went silent for one sharp second. Then several people laughed and applauded. I stood from my seat. "Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Step away from my husband." She turned toward me with a small smile. "Oh, Claire," she said into the microphone. "Do not ruin his night." More laughter moved through the ballroom. I walked toward the stage. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. "This is not a joke. Step away from him." Evan came down the stairs. For one hopeful moment, I thought he was going to apologize. Instead, he placed both hands on my shoulders and shoved me. My heel caught the edge of the carpet. I fell hard. Pain shot through my wrist, and my dress tore at the knee. Evan stood over me. "Know your place," he shouted. The words echoed through the ballroom. Someone near the stage laughed. Then another person joined in. Within seconds, the room erupted. I looked at the faces around me. Some people were amused. Some looked uncomfortable. Most simply watched. Vanessa leaned close to Evan and whispered something. He smiled. That smile changed everything. I pushed myself up from the floor. I did not cry. I did not slap him. I did not beg for an explanation. I walked onto the stage and picked up the microphone. "You are right, Evan. It is time everyone learned my place." The laughter faded. Evan reached for the microphone, but the chairman of the board, Arthur Hale, stood and said, "Let her speak." Evan froze. He had spent years trying to impress Arthur. He would never openly disobey him. I looked at the audience. "My place," I said, "is not behind Evan. It is not under his hand. And it is certainly not on the floor." Then I reached into my evening bag and removed a sealed envelope. Vanessa's smile disappeared. Evan stared at the envelope. He knew what it was. Or at least, he thought he did. "Claire," he said quietly, "this is neither the time nor the place." "Actually," I replied, "this is the perfect time, and this company is exactly the place." To understand what happened next, you need to know the secret Evan had never bothered to learn about me. My father, Daniel Whitmore, founded Whitmore Medical Systems 41 years earlier. The company began in our garage, where he designed hospital monitoring equipment. By the time I was 10, it employed nearly 200 people. My father loved the business, but he hated attention. When he died, he left his controlling shares in a private family trust. The documents used my mother's maiden name, Hale. Arthur Hale, the chairman Evan worshiped, was my mother's older brother and my trustee. I owned 42% of the voting shares. No one person owned more. Evan knew my family once had money, but he thought the company had been sold long ago. I let him believe that because my father taught me a simple lesson. Never tell someone how much power you have until you understand what they will do without it. For 20 years, Evan had believed I was only a freelance bookkeeper who worked from home. In reality, I reviewed the company's finances every quarter. I voted through the trust. I had supported Evan's early promotions because he was intelligent, disciplined, and, back then, kind. But power did not improve him. It revealed him. 6 months before the ceremony, I noticed unusual payments in the executive expense reports. Consulting fees were being sent to 3 small companies. All 3 used the same mailing address, a private mailbox rented by Vanessa. At first, I assumed it was an accounting error. Then the payments grew. $50,000 became $200,000. $200,000 became nearly $2 million. I asked Evan casually about the new consultants over dinner. He put down his fork and looked at me as if I were a child. "You would not understand corporate strategy," he said. That answer frightened me more than anger would have. The next morning, I called Arthur. We hired an independent forensic accountant named Priya Shah. She followed the money while I watched Evan. What we found was worse than an affair. Evan and Vanessa had created false vendors. They approved invoices for work that had never been performed. Part of the money paid for trips, jewelry, and a downtown apartment. The rest disappeared into an investment account controlled by Vanessa's brother. But that was not the deepest betrayal. 2 weeks before the ceremony, Priya found a draft agreement on the company's legal server. After becoming CEO, Evan planned to recommend the sale of Whitmore Medical Systems to Northstar Capital. The proposed price was far below the company's true value. Hidden in a separate agreement, Northstar promised Evan a $20 million position after the sale. Vanessa would receive $5 million. They were not only stealing from the company, they were preparing to sell it, remove hundreds of workers, and profit from the destruction. The board needed proof strong enough to survive a lawsuit. So Arthur allowed the CEO ceremony to continue while Priya finished tracing the accounts. I hated the plan. Every day I ate breakfast across from Evan and pretended I knew nothing. Every night he lied to my face. Then, on the afternoon of the ceremony, I received a message from an unknown number. It contained one sentence: "Ask Vanessa Abu Proj Siraduan." I showed it to Priya. She searched the company servers but found no project with that name. At 6 o'clock, only 1 hour before the ceremony, another message arrived. "Hey ass now techi o and lie, onibody nuiu." That message made my skin turn cold. I dialed the number. No one answered. I considered staying home, but Arthur told me the board would vote immediately after Evan's acceptance speech. My presence might be necessary. So I put on my blue dress, placed the evidence in my bag, and entered that ballroom. I did not expect Vanessa to kiss him. I did not expect him to shove me. But when I stood on that stage, I understood something clearly. Evan thought public humiliation would make me small and silent. Instead, he had created 500 witnesses. I opened the envelope. "This contains an emergency board resolution," I told the room. "It suspends Evan Bennett from all executive duties, effective immediately, pending investigations into fraud, theft, and breach of fiduciary responsibility." People began whispering. Evan laughed, but there was panic behind it. "She has no authority," he said. "My wife is upset. Security, escort her out." 2 security officers moved toward the stage. Arthur raised his hand. "Do not touch her," he ordered. Evan turned pale. Arthur walked to the stage and stood beside me. "For anyone who has not met her formally," he said, "this is Claire Whitmore Bennett. She is the principal beneficiary of the Whitmore Family Trust and the company's largest voting shareholder." Silence filled the room. The same employees who had laughed now stared at me. Vanessa stepped away from Evan. "That cannot be true," he whispered. I looked directly at him. "You told me to know my place." "I do. The question is whether you know yours." 3 board members joined us. Arthur called for the vote. Evan objected. He shouted that the accusations were false. He blamed Vanessa. Then he blamed the finance department. Finally, he blamed me. The resolution passed 7 votes to 1. Security removed his access badge. Vanessa tried to leave, but Priya entered through the side doors with 2 attorneys and a police detective. That was when the real chaos began. "You cannot keep me here?" Vanessa said. "No one is keeping you here," the detective replied. "But we would like to ask you about several fraudulent transfers." Vanessa looked at Evan. "You said this was protected." Evan's face twisted with rage. "Stop talking." She stared at him, suddenly understanding that he would sacrifice her to save himself. Then she said 4 words that surprised everyone. "Ask him about Crown." Project Crown. The mysterious message had been real. Evan moved toward her, but security blocked him. Vanessa reached into her purse and handed the detective a small drive. "He kept another set of records," she said. "The vendor payments are only part of it." Evan shouted that she was lying. She ignored him. Project Crown was Evan's private plan to manipulate the company's clinical trial data. One of Whitmore's new patient monitoring devices had shown a rare software failure during testing. No patient had been harmed, and the engineering team had already proposed a correction. But fixing it would delay the Northstar sale. Evan ordered 2 managers to remove the failed tests from the final report. 1 manager refused. Evan fired him. That former manager was the person who had sent me the messages. His name was Marcus Lee, and he was standing at the back of the ballroom. When Arthur invited him forward, Marcus looked terrified. Still, he walked to the stage. He explained that he had saved copies of the original reports. He had contacted a federal regulator that morning. He had also learned that Vanessa kept Evan's private files. Vanessa began to cry. I never knew about the test results, she said. I knew about the money and the sale, but not that. I believed her about the device. I did not forgive her for the rest. Evan looked at me as if I had betrayed him. Claire, we can talk about this at home. It was the first time all evening he used my name gently. There is no home for us anymore, I said. You are throwing away 20 years because of one mistake. No, I replied. You threw away 20 years one lie at a time. The detective escorted Evan and Vanessa into separate conference rooms. The ceremony ended. Employees were asked to remain while the attorneys collected witness statements and secured company devices. As I stepped off the stage, the pain in my wrist became unbearable. A young employee named Sophie helped me sit down and brought me ice. Mrs. Bennett, she said, I am sorry I did not help you when you fell. I looked around the room. Dozens of people avoided my eyes. Why didn't anyone? I asked. Sophie swallowed. Mr. Bennett punished people who challenged him. Everyone was afraid. Her answer stayed with me. Evan's cruelty had not begun with me. I had simply become its most public victim. That night, I did not return to our house. I stayed with Arthur and his wife. At 3 a.m, I finally removed my wedding ring and placed it on the bedside table. I expected to feel grief. What I felt was relief. The next morning, Evan called 17 times. I did not answer. Then he sent a message. I no tng's abo you or fadr mayit me or th compian wheel foul do ith me. For one frightening moment, I wondered if he had discovered an old secret that could destroy everything my father built. Arthur wanted me to ignore him. Priya disagreed. A frightened man reveals more when he thinks he still has power, she said. So I agreed to meet Evan in a private room at my attorney's office. 2 cameras recorded the conversation. My attorney watched from the next room. Evan arrived without his usual confidence. He looked exhausted. He placed a folder on the table. Your father bribed a hospital official in 1998, he said. If I release this, Whitmore's reputation is finished. Inside the folder was a copied payment for $100,000. For several seconds, I could not breathe. Then I noticed the receiving organization. The money had not gone to an official. It had gone to the hospital's charitable foundation after a tornado destroyed part of its children's wing. The transaction had been public. My father had even received a community award for it. Evan had removed the description and hoped I would panic. I closed the folder. Is this all you have? I asked. He stared at me. You need me, Claire. The board trusts my leadership. The board suspended you unanimously, except for the vote you gave yourself. North Star can still save the company. North Star withdrew its offer this morning. His shoulders dropped. I leaned forward. The company does not need saving from your crimes. It needs saving from you. Then he tried a different strategy. He cried. He told me Vanessa had manipulated him. He said the pressure of becoming CEO had changed him. He promised counseling. He promised honesty. He promised to spend the rest of his life repairing our marriage. 5 years earlier, those tears might have broken me. But I remembered him smiling while I lay on the floor. You are not sorry because you hurt me, I said. You are sorry because hurting me cost you everything. I slid divorce papers across the table. Evan refused to sign them. That was fine. I had not come to negotiate. Over the following months, investigators uncovered more evidence. Vanessa accepted the agreement and provided records of every payment. She admitted the affair had lasted almost 2 years. Evan had promised to marry her after divorcing me. At the same time, he had been secretly dating a North Star executive. When Vanessa learned that, her remaining loyalty disappeared. Evan was charged with fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, and falsifying regulated records. The judge sentenced him to 9 years in federal prison. Vanessa received a shorter sentence because she cooperated. I did not attend every day of the trial. Revenge did not require me to watch him suffer. Justice required me to make sure he could never hurt the company or its employees again. My divorce was finalized 7 months after the ceremony. Under our agreement, Evan lost any claim to assets connected to the family trust. The house was sold. I donated my share of the proceeds to a legal fund for employees who report corporate misconduct. The board asked me to become CEO. I refused. I knew enough to protect the company, but leadership should not be inherited like jewelry. We conducted a national search and chose Priya Shah. She was intelligent, honest, and unafraid to ask difficult questions. Marcus Lee returned as Director of Product Safety. Every employee who had been punished for questioning Evan received an independent review. Several were rehired. Others received settlements and written apologies. We delayed the new device, corrected the software, and repeated every clinical test. It cost millions of dollars and nearly a year of work. It was worth it. At the next annual meeting, I stood in the same ballroom where I had been shoved to the floor. This time, there was no giant photograph of one man behind the stage. The screen displayed the names of hundreds of employees who had helped rebuild the company. Sophie, the young woman who had helped me that night, introduced a new workplace policy. Any employee could report misconduct directly to an independent committee without fear of retaliation. When she finished, the room applauded. It sounded different from the laughter I remembered. It was not cruel or frightened. It was hopeful. After the meeting, Arthur found me alone near the stage. "Your father would be proud," he said. I looked at the place where I had fallen. For a long time, I had been ashamed that 500 people saw my husband humiliate me. Then I understood that the shame never belonged to me. It belonged to the man who used violence to feel powerful. It belonged to the people who laughed because they believed cruelty was safer than courage. And it belonged to a culture that had confused fear with respect. I did not destroy Evan. His own choices did that. All I did was stop protecting him from the consequences. Today, I still serve as a family trust's principal shareholder. I also work with organizations that help people recognize financial and emotional abuse. Whenever someone tells me they are afraid to leave because their partner has convinced them they are powerless, I share one truth. Power does not always look like shouting. Sometimes power is the quiet moment when you stand up, even while everyone expects you to stay down. Evan told me to know my place. So I found it, not beside him, not beneath him, but beyond him. And the moment I stopped accepting the floor was the moment his kingdom began to fall.